Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to one of the pre-performance talks. As many of you know, there is a series of talks, both pre- and post-performance, at Chichester Festival Theatre this year to celebrate the theatre's 50th anniversary. And it is my enormous pleasure this evening to be introducing to you Dr. Rosamund Bartlett, who is going to talk about Uncle Vanya. My name's Kate Mosse, and I'm doing several of these pre-performance talks, and also, some of you know, have written the book about Chichester Festival Theatre's first 50 years. It will be available, it publishes on the 8th of June, before any of you come up afterwards and ask me where it is. Before we start, could I ask of this audience, who has already seen the production of Vanya that is going to be on here in a moment? Most of you, that's fine. And how many are going in tonight? Excellent. That's pretty much a full house, Rupert, I think. And in fact, Dr. Bartlett is going in with her parents tonight, and welcome parents too. Dr. Rosamund Bartlett is a writer, a translator, and a lecturer. She is a very distinguished biographer. Her biography of Tolstoy was longlisted for the Samuel Johnson Prize, which is the leading biography prize in the UK. She's also, she would probably refute this, but an expert on classical music as well, has written about Shostakovich, and her latest book is a wonderful book about the first surreal opera, which we're not going to have time to talk about much tonight, Victory Over the Sun. But of course, it is for her work on Chekhov that we are so very grateful that she's here this evening. Not only has Rosamund written a very wonderful biography, Scenes from a Life, and there are copies available to buy, and I know Dr. Bartlett will sign if you would like that, but also her translations of the short stories and letters are throughout the world, certainly one of those particular translations, that relationship of a writer with another writer that are particularly lauded. And I know that we're going to talk a little bit about that this evening. She was also awarded the Chekhov 150th Anniversary Medal and is the founding director of the Anton Chekhov Foundation. Now, this evening, we're going to talk we won't have much time, sadly, about Vanya. Those of you who are Chichesterians will know that Vanya has a very special place in the history of Chichester Festival Theatre. It was in that first season in July 1962 that Laurence Olivier, Rosemary Harris, Joan Plowright and Michael Redgrave stepped onto the main house stage over there and did that production of Uncle Vanya that saved the theatre. It meant that the theatre opened again in 1963. Without that Vanya, it wouldn't have done. It was reprised in 1963 and then again went on to be made into film and go on to the National Theatre. There was also a production of Uncle Vanya here in 1996 with Derek Jacobi, who is also going to be back on the stage in this anniversary season. And of course now we have a wonderful production of Vanya with Roger Allam. So with that sort of preamble, I suppose, both with Chichester and in general context, what is it, Dr. Bartlett, about Vanya that is one of those plays written in 1896, first performed Moscow Art Theatre 1899, but still is so live and real to audiences today?
Well, this is probably the first play that Chekhov wrote that really comes when he's absolutely at his prime. It's the only play he wrote at his country estate in Minerva, which is the place he was happiest probably in his life. So he had this beautiful country estate south of Moscow, and he had adapted that earlier play, The Wood Demon, which hadn't really worked out. He'd put the disaster of the Seagull behind him. You probably know that he wrote this play, The Seagull, which was disastrously staged by the Imperial Theatres, which was this huge juggernaut of a state institution that was totally unsuited to the intimate kinds of drama that we're going to see tonight. And we're absolutely in the perfect setting here because this is a play about claustrophobia, so we're going to be surrounded on all sides. And the theatre that the Seagull was staged in was this enormous neoclassical theatre that housed 2,000 people, and it had a state repertory company, and the people were sort of almost like civil servants. They received salaries, and they just did not get nuance and irony. And so it was very traumatic for Chekhov. He fled on the sort of milk train back from the theatre that same night after the premiere. He just, he was absolutely traumatised. But nevertheless, he came back to The Wood Demon and started revising it. And actually, I think, in a way, we were driving down tonight and listening to the beginning of Die Walküre, Life from the Met. And in a way, the 4 last plays of Chekhov are a kind of tetralogy. And the Rheingold is a sort of prelude, isn't it, to the other 3 with The Ring. And I think The Seagull is a very great play, but it's actually not quite on the level of the last 3. So Uncle Vanya is the sort of first really great of those last 3 plays. And it's the first play, probably in the whole of the Russian dramatic repertoire, that features a doctor as a central character. And Chekhov himself was a doctor, of course, and he was hugely involved with Zemstva medicine when he was living in the countryside. And I think we all take it for granted. I mean, there are lots of things we take for granted about Chekhov's plays, but, doctors, for example, they're respected members of society. They come from the middle class. They're usually paid pretty well in this country. But in Russia, until the 1860s, there was no provision of medicine for most of the population. There were literally tens of thousands of people per one doctor. And the great reforms of the 1860s introduced public health for the first time as an item on the agenda. And these zemstvas, which was the first kind of local self-government, started bringing in the provision of medicine. And so the zemstva doctor, and Astrov is a zemstva doctor, is someone who is very socially committed. And Chekhov, who trained as a doctor, continued treating his peasants when he was living in the countryside. He knew many of these zemstva doctors. So a lot of the very good sides of Astrov are reflections of the very wonderful work that these zemstva doctors were bringing to areas that had never had medical care before. And there's an awful lot of sort of this idea of the sort of slave mentality in Uncle Vanya. And when doctors treated peasants in the 1870s, 1880s, the peasants saw them as royalty, yes, your highness, because the idea that they actually could receive any kind of medical care was extraordinary. And at the same time, that was just the time when doctors actually began to receive some respect, because until then, from the sort of nobility, and this is a caste society we're talking about in Imperial Russia, doctors were treated like servants. They came in the back door. They didn't have the kind of social status that they have now. So it's quite interesting to know that, really, because it's not that a doctor was a sort of normal character for a play about them.
So would the audience, seeing it for the first time, would that have seemed very radical then, to have a doctor who, in a funny sort of way, is almost the lead character in some
It is a radical thing, yeah. And that Chekhov puts ordinary people in his plays. So what is special about Uncle Vanya and what is special about all his last plays is that his main characters, they're not sort of huge, tragic heroes. There are elements of tragedy to their lives, but they're ordinary people whom Russians could identify with, and they particularly identify with Vanya, as it happens. And Vanya, of course, is a short form of Ivan, and Ivan in Russian is the same as John in English. So he's a kind of everyman, and Chekhov does choose names with care. Take the 2 female characters. We've got Elena and Sonia. And Sonia is the short form for Sophia, which is the Greek form of wisdom. Elena doesn't have that kind of symbolic meaning, but Chekhov, when he first went to the theatre when he was 13 years old, he saw Offenbach's La Belle Hélène, this uproarious operetta, and that's actually quite relevant because he never ever left that tradition quite behind. He always said with him, that the comic alternates with the tragic, and you find in this play that there's an awful lot of pathos, but there's an awful lot of ridiculous humour, which is actually very deadpan. I mean, the character of Telegin, who is very serious, he says, well, my wife left me, the day after we got married because I'm, not very attractive, and I've carried on paying for her all this time, and Elena gets his name wrong, and So there are lots of funny. Then there's a point where Vanya says, "Well, I could have been a Dostoevsky." There are all sorts of sort of funny, poignant moments which are actually quite funny. And a lot of the sort of tension in the play is between the characters. They don't have very much self-awareness, and yet we as the audience can perceive it in a different way. So that's why there are sort of so many ways in which this play appeals not only to sort of 19th century Russians, but of course to us, because what Chekhov is actually pinpointing is the absurdity of the human condition. And it's the same as it was for 19th century Russians as it is for us today.
Do you think that's really it? That even though there's completely different experiences, they're in this claustrophobic place, it's hot, they're all stuck together, but that actually the issues that they will feel, whether it's unrequited love or the sense of the wasted life, or why did I give up all of this, in Vanya's case, to support this old professor, that they are so absolutely archetypal emotions that the 100 years odd doesn't matter.
Well, I think that must be the case, because we are still coming to see so many productions, and this is a play. Chekhov's language is so sparse, and somehow it's sort of like, in dramatic terms, the music of Mozart. It's so sort of classically simple, so you can draw so much out of it. It's rather like a wonderful piece of music can be interpreted in different ways, played with different kinds of instruments, conducted fast or slow. So it is open to a number of different interpretations. And yes, I think we can all relate to investing a huge amount of time in something and then discovering that it was, fruitless, or, people being attracted to someone who's not attracted, I think they're all things that don't really change in the human condition.
And just going back to something that you said about the fact that Chekhov he was quite a radical playwright in many ways.
Yes, I think that's also he's there's a very interesting article by an American Slavist called Simon Karlinski. He's called Chekhov the Gentle Subversive, because he is a great revolutionary in so many ways, but it's very, very subtle. And in the 21st century, you could miss it. But the fact that, he had a doctor as one of his characters. Russian theatre, when Chekhov got going, was this sort of incredibly sort of ossified institution that, until the 1880s, was actually organised totally by the imperial crown. They had the imperial theatres. There were 2 theatres in Moscow, there were 2 theatres in St. Petersburg, and it was for reasons of censorship that they controlled what was put on. So if you can imagine a very, very conservative, despotic state running theatrical life, you can imagine that they weren't actually sort of places for artistic innovation. And the kind of plays that got put on, they had sort of cliched plots, and there was no director at all. And people who had the starring roles would choose what costumes they wanted to wear. So there was no sort of coherence. And so what Stanislavski and Nemirovich Danchenko did in 1897, when they founded the Moscow Art Theatre, was to bring something totally new, so an element of realism to the stage. And in 1882, Alexander III, who didn't do very many good things in Russia, he did nevertheless abolish the monopoly of the imperial theatres that made it possible for private individuals to open theatres. And all the money, as it is today, was in Moscow. That's where all the business went on. And Stanislavski came from a merchant background and put his family money, got other merchants to put money into this new theatre company. And they wanted to have an idea of ensemble, and Chekhov's plays were absolutely perfect because they do require someone to direct, and there's no obvious main character. Same for Uncle Vanya, so that's also rebellious. There's no obvious plot in Uncle Vanya. What happens? We've got these 4 acts, and it's scenes from country life. It's rather sort of non-committal. And yes, we do have a gun going off, but it's sort of rather farcical actually when it happens. And no one, there's no sort of boy meets girl and they get married and live happily ever after. So the fact that Chekhov is actually writing a play about nothing very much is something very radical. But of course, actually, a lot goes on. And it's often the stuff that actually isn't said, the stuff that happens backstage. And I think one of the other sort of subversive things is, if you think about the title of the play, because actually I think there is a hero, or rather a heroine, Uncle Vanya. Who is Uncle Vanya? He's the uncle of Sonia. Actually, the great heroine of the play is Sonia, isn't she? She's the one character in the play who's actually not absurd or trivialised.
And she's moral. I mean,
she's moral, and she's the one who restores some human dignity at the end of the play, because she said, "Come on, Vanya, we've got to get back to work again." And actually, for Chekhov too, hard work. He was someone who worked incredibly hard throughout his life, not just as a short story writer, as a playwright, but he built schools, he worked as a doctor, he planted trees. The ecology theme was hugely important. And so Sonia is incredibly important. So he doesn't call his play, Sonia, because she's so self-effacing. And there's a terrible point in the play earlier on too, when Astrov says, "Oh, I think, the whole of a person should be beautiful." He goes on, because he's absolutely obsessed with Elena. And Elena's name, of course, is there because when Chekhov saw that Offenbach play, he's thinking of Helena of Troy, of course. I should have said that. And actually, Sonia is there, and she's dying to be his wife, and he doesn't notice her at all. Isn't that sort of one of life's little tragedies? But I've been reading the Russian text recently, and I was really struck more than ever by the last words of Sonia, which are so extraordinarily beautiful. This is the language of the play. Even if the words are rather plain and simple, as a whole, it's a thing of beauty. And at the end, with all these beautiful pauses that give the play a sort of musical feel, there's a wonderful rhythm to it. At the end, when all the intruders leave finally, and Sonia's left with her Uncle Vanya, and they get back to work, and Telyagin's strumming his guitar, and the Marina, the nurse, is sort of fussing around with her chickens or whatever. And Sonia says, don't worry, it's going to be jolly hard. No, we'll see the whole sky in diamonds. And the play is, written in this beautiful language, but it goes off into a totally different register at the end. Total poetry. And Rachmaninoff was so moved by the beauty of those last words, he just set them straight to music, which says, I think, something about the effect it has. And it's something that Richard Eyre has mentioned several times when he's been talking about Chekhov. In Russian, the last words, we shall rest, and we отдохнем. In Russian, they have this very soft sound. It's impossible for a translator to render those very soft words, we отдохнем, in a similar way. We shall rest. It's very hard.
And in fact, Michael Frayn, you will see, has chosen not to use that word in this translation of
because he's such a good Russian speaker himself. Yeah, so it's a wonderful thing to hear the play in his translation, because he does know the language very well. He knows the culture, which is very important.
But many people who saw the Olivier Redgrave Vanya across the road in 1962, almost every single person who I talked to remembered Joan Plowright just saying, "And we shall rest." And that was oddly almost just, and the light going down on the point of the stage opposite. So what it sounds like you're saying, Dr. Bartlett, is that in a way there's no obvious hero or heroine. Is there an obvious theme or not? Some people say it is about the wasted life, some people say it is about the forest and the deforestation that's going on. Would you say that it is all of those things and none of them?
I think probably I would say that it's about waste in general. And if we're to think about the Russian situation, the 1890s, Alexander III becomes Tsar in 1881 when his father is assassinated, and Alexander II was the one to introduce the reforms, and they didn't go far enough, and he ended up being assassinated by revolutionaries, and so Alexander III tried to sort of undo all that program of reform. So it was a very depressing time. And so in a way, Chekhov's talking about the waste of Russia, the huge resources of Russia, the huge waste of people like Uncle Vanya. I mean, yeah, maybe he should have been, he could have been a Dostoevsky, but The problem of Imperial Russia was one that carried over to the Soviet Union, where people had this slave mentality. It carried over after the end of serfdom, and it wasn't just the peasant class. The intelligentsia was stuck as well because they had no means of taking any direct part in their government. There was no houses of parliament in Russia. Even after the 1905 revolution, there was the Duma eventually, but it was very ineffective. And so there were a lot of British people like Maurice Barrow who went to see the play in 1905, performed by the Moscow Art Theatre, who thought it was a play about contemporary Russia and about the claustrophobia of Russia, the fact, and people are aware that they're on the brink of revolution. They're not they don't know when it's going to be exactly, but Russia was a bankrupt society then, and they'd had, almost 300 years of Romanov rule, where it was impossible really to take responsibility for your own life. And, Vanya, why does he go on working for the professor? Why doesn't he just get up and go? Why don't the three sisters buy a ticket and go to Moscow?
Yes, that's the unanswered question of all of theatre.
And there's sort of, an awful lot of talk, and even now you go to Russia and there's an awful lot of talk. I mean, it's been great to see that actually there's been some action, whether it'll, lead anywhere, I don't know, but there's a sort of rather depressing precedent in Russia for things always to be the same.
Is that a fatalism, though?
Yeah, I think it is. There's a huge amount of fatalism, yeah. So I think, yes, the play does reflect a lot of contemporary Russia. What was the other thing you were asking about?
You're speaking so beautifully, it doesn't really matter what I asked, I think, truthfully. But one of the things that struck me seeing this production and thinking about the questions for you was, do you think that there is that sense, even though you say nothing actually happens, the interlopers come, it's August, they chuck everything up in the air, the meal's at the wrong time and everybody's drinking too much. But the point at which there could be the drama, when Vanya has enough and he gets the gun, nobody's had any sleep. They're all either hungover or half cut, the men at least. And even that doesn't turn into a moment of high drama. So do you think that actually that is the, if you like, the message of the play, which is they are incapable of raising themselves to the tragedy required of the situation?
Oh, you were talking about waste, weren't you? Well, yes,
yeah.
Because of course they've never had it's all about, ideals, the gap between people's perception of themselves and the reality of things. And yes, they don't feel they're able to pursue anything more. And Elena, married to this old professor. I mean, I do think it's, if you're interested in the kind of sort of theme variations, the variations on this play are all the stories that Chekhov wrote around this time. There's a wonderful story called In the Cart about a village school teacher and the story is just about her journey from the town back to her home. And she has a really terrible life of drudgery, and there's no hope of it getting any better. And she's a real sort of Sonia character. But what's so amazing about the play, and I think this is probably also why we keep coming back to it, is that it's not satirical. There's no sort of cruelty there, because Chekhov has got such great compassion. There's such a lot of humanity in the play. So he's sort of sending all the characters up, except maybe Sonia, but he's also very sympathetic. So Vanya is a character who is ridiculous. I mean, he's totally ridiculous, but he's also really sad and tragic, and we love him at the end at the same time as well. And there's another set of stories too which fit in very well, and they're also written right at the time that Uncle Vanya was being reworked, and it's a trilogy of stories. There's The Man in a Case, Gooseberries, and About Love. And The Man in a Case is about a classicist, an academic person who is sort of sealed from reality by his sort of classic knowledge. And in the play, we have the professor walking about in the height of summer in his galoshes and overcoat and his umbrella, and he's like a sort of man in a case. And he doesn't seem to have very much contact with reality. He's someone who's been stuck in some sort of library and needs to get out more, doesn't he? And, and then the story Gooseberries is about someone who saves up all his life to buy a country estate, and is so sort of desperate to reach this goal that he doesn't actually think about the sort of repercussions and the realities of it. And his brother comes to visit and is given this plate of gooseberries, and they're sour. You know, and there are all kinds of ironies there. And then in About Love is about two people who fall in love, and she's married, and you know it doesn't quite happen, and then they go away. So again, there's sort of these missed opportunities, and they're all sort of, in a way, oblique comments on the sort of things which are going on in this play.
Do you feel that Chekhov works out themes or emotions or interrelationships between people in short stories before he puts them into the plays, or is the work much more organic than that one doesn't necessarily
I think we should see the work as much more organic, and I've always been slightly disappointed that people in the theatre don't study the stories more, and I have to lay my cards on the table. I'm a great proselytizer for Chekhov short stories. They give us so much insight into the world of the plays, and the short stories are all little plays on their own, actually, and
because they're character driven.
And they reflect the same kinds of themes. So I think Chekhov probably wouldn't have differentiated in a way, and the stories in the plays are almost like the sort of short prose in a way. They're very, very much interlinked.
With Vanya, you know, you've explained that it's part of the last big three, as it were. Chekhov's way of working up a play, did he write a first draft? Did he write a first act? Can you just tell us a little bit about how Vanya came to be the 4-act play that we know now?
Well, it's actually quite difficult to talk about his working methods because he was meticulous about erasing his manuscript. So we've got...
Because he didn't want people like us to do that?
Yes,
or?
Exactly.
Yeah, right,
yes.
Okay.
So we've got the manuscript of the play. I mean, you know, he went to the theatre when he was 13 for the first time. He loved farce. He wrote the play Ivanov in 1887, which was a kind of halfway house between conventional drama and this new kind of playwriting, which was the sort of theatre of mood, and which sort of put ordinary people on the stage. And then he wrote 2 one-act farces, you know, the Bear and the Proposal, and wrote The Wood Demon, which was this sort of strange play that just didn't quite work out, and then The Seagull. So we know about his trajectory up until that point, but we don't have masses and masses of manuscripts which show us
and
how
he didn't
worked.
write in his letters about, you know, I have this character Sonia, or I have, you know, Teligin. You know, he didn't sort of put them into his real life.
Well, you can see an awful lot of people from his real life in his stories and plays, and sometimes he was a little bit too close to the bone. People got quite upset about it, actually. But by and large, no, he didn't. He was very, very reticent. He didn't wear his heart on his sleeve in that respect. And that's probably why we like him so much in England, because we think he's English. He's sort of got this sort of, you know, this ironic reserve. And I think when we get companies like the Marley Theatre from Petersburg coming and putting on Chekhov, we are reminded actually how Russian he is, because there is an awful lot that we can relate to in this country with Chekhov, but he is at the same time very passionate. And I remember they did a wonderful film about the British production of Ivanov going to Moscow, and the Russian actors who met with these British actors were rather sort of nonplussed by how sort of timid it was emotionally, and they were saying, well, actually, we do, everything sort of straight on. And it's true. When you go to Russia and you see your Russian friends, they immediately want to get straight down to the sort of, the essential questions and talk about sort of intimate things. And Chekhov is very direct. He's the absolute opposite to a writer like Pasternak, for example, who's always sort of weeding around. Chekhov's always sort of straight on the mark, and that's quite remarkable.
I had a Russian friend once, journalist, Vitaly Vitaliev, you'll probably know him, and he came to England, was very nonplussed, because he said, it's very odd, I go to a party and people ask how I got here. He said, in Russia, they say, what do you think of me?
Exactly, yeah.
Moving on to the idea of translation, because obviously you're a very celebrated translator as well, and a very lyrical. I know that the lyricism of the language is very important to you. When did it happen that Vanya, or indeed any of Chekhov's plays, first started to be translated? And what languages were they first translated into? Where was that relationship with the wider world
I
starting?
think probably French and English were the first language they got translated into, and I'm not actually sure of the stage history, but probably in the 20s and 30s. And that's when they started translating the stories too. And what was interesting is that when Chekhov started appearing in English for the first time, it was people like Virginia Woolf who read him and realised that he was actually a modernist, because for a long time, in Russia certainly, people wanted to see Chekhov as a sort of 19th century realist alongside people like Tolstoy and Turgenev, and he's not, because there's something that's slightly askance with him. There's that irony, and the irony is, is the modern mode, isn't it, for the 20th century? So they got more and more popular, I think, as the 20th century went on, and I think that's why we need more and more translations every generation, because we sort of see different things going on there in the text.
And with the nature of the translation, we were talking about this before, that sort of sense of the music of it. Now, I know that this is a very important part of how you translate. When you're approaching something like Vanya in the audience, when you are listening to it in English, are you hearing it in Russian?
I'm probably remembering the words in Russian, yes, but I think a good translator will somehow reproduce the rhythms. And I know that when I translate the stories, and I've never done any of his plays, not yet anyway, I'm thinking first and foremost of the sound of the original, of the shape of the phrase. And in the prose, at least, Chekhov's very particular about his sentence lengths and about his punctuation. I mean, you can get very nerdy about punctuation and semicolons and dots and things at the end of sentences. But if you look at the way he constructs his stories, you'll see that he puts a short sentence before a very long one, and then a medium sense one. And it's to create, it's a bit like sort of listening to a Schubert sonata. There's a sort of long phrase. And you really do, as a translator, need to listen out. And I did actually indeed take my cue from Shostakovich, who loved Chekhov to death. And when he died in 1975, it was a short story by Chekhov that his wife read to him. It was a story, Gusiev, and for him that was the most musical prose in all of Russian literature. And it happens to be the story that has the most number of incidences of 3 dots at the end of the sentences. It's not an ellipsis, it's a sort of trailing off. It's a kind of impressionistic device,
sort of like
rather like a pause in the plays, because Chekhov was the first person to use pauses in a musical way, I think, probably. And so you need to be able to convey that sense too. And they're beautifully crafted, all these plays. You know, there is a kind of sonata form in the stories, and there's also, as Jonathan Miller has pointed out, a sonata form going on in the plays in their construction. You know, in Uncle Vanya, we begin with things being disrupted. You know, Vanya and Sonia have been working really hard, and at the end of the play we go back to that. And it's as if there's a sort of, you know, a theme and a sub-theme going on. And so Shostakovich was very aware of that kind of musical writing. Tchaikovsky also loved Chekhov because I'm translating Tolstoy at the moment, and he's such a different kind of writer. Chekhov very much is a writer from the next generation on, who is thinking like a Virginia Woolf in terms of a sort of stream of consciousness. There's a sort of, almost a Wagnerian endless melody going on, I suppose, in the way he conceives things.
You've talked about his influence on composers and possibly their influence on him. Do you think, therefore, that Chekhov, much of the inspiration or his importance lies in the other art forms around him, not just in theatre? It sounds like you're saying that he's had a huge amount of influence in areas outside of simply the theatre.
I think he's had a huge influence, actually, precisely in the theatre. These days we think of him as the most important playwright after Shakespeare, don't we? And I think in terms of short stories too, he's regarded as the father of the modern short story. I mean, he sort of tore up the rule book about writing short stories when he started out in the 1880s. And I think he is the creator of modern drama. I mean, a lot of the theatre of the absurd of the 20th century really finds its roots in Chekhov, doesn't it?
Yes, and it's, I mean, I went with my mum, who's also here in the audience, to see the Anthony Hopkins film, August, which is Vanya put in the Welsh Valleys. And it's sometimes, I think, I don't know if you'd agree, that it's when you see something that is transposed completely, you realise how the architecture is quite brilliant, because there's nothing that lets it down. It is possible to do that. It sounds ironic, but it's actually that way around. I wonder if have you got favourite Vanyas? I know that's a rather crass question.
I'm just immediately thinking, as you say that, of Vanya on 42nd Street, that fantastic film by Louis Malle, and with Julianne Moore as Elena and Wallace Shawn as Vanya. And, you know, you get this group of people coming in off the street, and then suddenly you're in the play, and it just works brilliantly. So they're just sort of speaking the lines. They're not in costume or anything, but this drama evolves, and so that's a very favourite production for me. I think that, you know, helps us sort of transcend the time in which it was written. There was a great Russian actor called Innokenty Smoktunovsky, a wonderful name, and he starred in a film by Konchalovsky of the play from the 1970s. I actually really love the film that was made of the original Olivier staging here. I think that's got a lot to offer as well.
And in fact, on the CFT website, they've got a little clip of it, actually.
It's marvellous.
There's also, some people will know this, a rather apocryphal story, that there were all sorts of planning problems with the theatre, that it was supposed to be opening in a matter of weeks' time, but yet the right bits of paper from the fire officer and things had not yet been given. So there was this awful thing that the theatre was supposed to open, but it wouldn't be allowed to. And they had to bring the fire officers in. It was only about 10 days before the theatre opened. And as they were going round, you know, the founder of the theatre says, you know, he started to notice there was this strange old man as part of the party. They had no idea who he was. And he looked like a doctor walking around, and it was Olivier Azastrov wandering around in his costume going, oh, quickly go over there, never mind about the lights, you know. So it's also that idea of certain characters are so big that they step out of the context of the work within which they're written. Now, we've got time for a couple of questions. We weren't sure whether you would want to ask them or not, so don't feel honour bound to. But since so many of you have seen the production, is there anybody who would like to ask Dr. Bartlett a question? Gentleman there.
One question. This is one of the short stories, and just your remarks on this particular story. Romance with double bass.
Oh, do you want to?
Yeah, I just would like you to, you know, say a few words about that particular.
Romance Kontrabassum. It's a wonderful early short story. It's one of his funny stories, and I think we do tend to forget that Chekhov was a comic writer, and this one is just total delight, because it's about some musicians going off to play at a summer party at a dacha, and they decide to go swimming, and they take their clothes off and jump in when they see this beautiful girl, and then their clothes are stolen, and they have to the double bassist has to jump into his double bass case, and he gets carried to the party in the end. I don't want to give the whole story away, but it's an absolute delight. And Chekhov never left his comic roots behind, and it's interesting that, you know, this is a play that's styled scenes from country life, and that's why I called my biography Scenes from a Life. It was a sort of nod to that, really, because he was a very impressionistic writer, and he managed to say so much with so little, and it's an impressionistic biography, because if you want to do the whole thing, you know, you'd have to go into huge detail. But he started off with The Seagull, which was a comedy, and he ended with a comedy, which is the Cherry Orchard, and he was always really upset with Stanislavski, always wanting to put too much realistic detail. You know, that Astrov is always swatting flies, you know, and things. And he did say oh, and my next play, and he was going to set it in the Arctic, and he was going to have a character say, how wonderful it is that there aren't any flies here.
Yes. And no trees. Yeah. Where would we be without the trees?
So that was his sort of last will and testament, the Chariot. It was one of the very last things he wrote. So he didn't feel gloomy at the end of his life, even though, I mean, Three Sisters is a hard play, because he was stuck in Yalta, yearning to be in Moscow, and dying, living in this beautiful house, but so far from everyone. He was so ill that he could barely bend down to prune the roses in his beautiful garden, which we're trying to restore now. Actually, it's our next stage of our campaign to keep the house in Yalta going. But yes, we need to remember that Chekhov did have his origins in making people laugh.
Yeah. Is there another question? Gentleman there, and then lady there.
In a play, we look for things being advanced in each scene. In a Shakespearean history, that might be decisions being taken, people being toppled from power and so on. What are we looking for being advanced in a scene from Uncle Vanya? I'm going to see it tonight. What are we looking for being advanced? Is it people's self-knowledge? Is it knowledge of others? What sort of action, however subtle, is there?
Well, I don't think there was any sort of direct action as such. It's sort of indirect action, and it's a lot of things that maybe you might not expect. And I don't think Chekhov would want the audience to have any particular expectation. He's wanting to sort of provoke thought, and really all his work. I mean, people tend to see him as this sort of gloomy writer who writes these sort of heavy plays and these rather sort of sad stories about sad people, but actually it's all a way of getting to people to think about their lives. These are characters who don't have much insight into their own psychological makeup, into their own lives, and as the audience, Chekhov's holding up a mirror. We see ourselves in the characters. I think probably he's trying to, like so many other of the great Russian writers, is trying to prompt his reader or his audience to actually reflect on their own lives. And there's a wonderful passage at the end of the story, Gooseberries, when someone says, there should be a man with a little hammer knocking on the door of every happy person to remind them that there are unhappy people, for example. And there are an awful lot of stories about people who feel that they've wasted their lives. There are an awful lot of people who don't realise their potential. And there are a lot of moments in the plays too, and you wonder, well, what is it that's stopping them? It's their own sort of self-delusion. So an awful lot of Chekhov is about illusion, delusion, and the reality. What's going on inside our head, and actually what's going on in actual fact.
That's wonderful. And lady there is the last question.
I wanted to ask about this question of comedy and tragedy, and I know that Russians used to say of early English productions that they were much too wistful and autumnal, and that they hadn't got the humour. And I certainly think this production here is wonderful on that side, wonderful on the humour. And I wondered if Vanya was easier for English directors to get from the word go, the fact that it's so volatile that really you have to have some humour there, because the seeds of self-destruction are so obvious so quickly that unless you have humour, you're going to go right down a pit very quickly and destroy your production.
I think that's beautifully said. Yeah, no, I don't think I could improve on that, because you run through the whole gamut of emotions with all of the characters, particularly Vanya, don't you? He's sort of he goes from one extreme to the other. I mean, these sort of incredibly poignant moments where he sort of bought some flowers, and I don't want to go and ruin the story if people haven't seen it, but and it's funny because it makes me think actually, yes, probably those criticisms of the early productions were valid. I was very shocked when I first saw Chekhov in Soviet Russia, because in a way Chekhov was old hat, and they wanted to sort of do away with the old sort of dreary pre-revolutionary Russia mentality. And what they did was to sort of treat it as total farce, which was the absolute opposite of that. And it was also very jarring, actually, and dismaying. And to actually bring it off, to have that balance, it's a very, very difficult thing to pull off, indeed, I think.
Well, I mean, I think all of us could carry on listening to you for the rest of the evening, but I'm afraid we have to give the theatre back to the actors. But for those of you who would like to buy the Chekhov Scenes from a Life, Dr. Bartlett is very happy to sign copies out there in a moment. The next pre-production talk is Penelope Keith in the Festival Theatre, but we're doing that at 5 o'clock on Wednesday, so don't be late. But I think it just remains to say that this has been an extraordinary 45 minutes. I think, you know, very rarely is it that you feel you have not only learnt about an author's particular play, Vanya, that many of us have either seen or are about to see, but also in the context of a life. So could you all join me for saying a huge thank you to Dr. Bartlett.